I'd like to welcome to the stage Rosalie Wagner, from France originally, but now living in Berlin, a self-described font engineer. And she's going to tell us about how she thinks about font engineering as a profession. Her background is she's worked at several interesting places in the font world. She's worked with Black Foundry, with Alphabet in Berlin, with Google currently, and she's done freelancing too. But she's also trained as a typeface designer. So I'm personally interested how you define font engineering. I consider myself a font engineer. I don't always call myself that. Maybe I need to start calling myself that. But yeah, I'm really interested to see your take on this, Rosalie. So we've got a talk of just over half an hour, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A. So throw your questions into the question mark tab as usual, and we'll get to them after Rosalie's video plays. So anything you want to add before we get going, Rosalie?
No, it's okay. We can start the recording.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I am Rosalie Wagner and I am a type designer slash font engineer. I'd like to talk about font engineering and to try to give a broad definition of it. Indeed, the information is hard to find and, in my opinion, quite needed. We are at the second iteration of this talk. I already integrated some feedback from the previous talk that took place in the ICTVC in Greece, and of course, I would like to integrate yours. This is everything we're going to talk about, and I would like to first make a little warning. Indeed, any standardization effort induce some kind of simplification at first. Also, I don't want to go into details that everyone here already know about. So I count on your judgment to understand that reality is always a bit more complex, that the process is not so linear, etc. For the definition, keep in mind that we are talking about current usage of fonts, not historical one. And yeah, we're gonna try to clarify quickly all those terms to avoid any confusion in the rest of the presentation. So, a typeface is a set of glyph sharing common design principle. You could say, for example, that it is quite thick and impactful, etc. When we speak about typeface, we often refer to a visual impression and or a design intention. The font would refer to the actual software embedding this set of glyph and also all the metadata and features that allow installation, rendering on screen, embedding in document, print, etc. You could say, for example, that you can't install the font file. So when we speak about font, we mostly speak about the user experience and or how it is rendered by a device. So the type designer would be the person who creates this set of glyph following a certain intention, and the font engineer would be the person that built the font software, that transformed the design into a proper product that can be installed, displayed, and print. They turn the typeface into a font software. The software engineer is a way broader profession. They create digital tools, the one we would use to create and produce fonts, but also all kinds of tools such as other type of softwares and scripts, application, API, etc. And since fonts are softwares, a software engineer can also be a font engineer if they specialize in the matter. But what we need to remind here is that a font engineer is not necessarily expected to be a software engineer. The Python developer would make script and plugins for to help the design and or the production process. In general, those are Python based, but if someone has this kind of knowledge, they would easily use a bit of other languages, eventually develop web pages. Why not? So I wanted to clarify this term because when hiring a font engineer, Foundries also expect someone that can develop their scripts or plugin, and and it is not necessarily the case. A font engineer can use other people's scripts without having to code one themselves. But we will come back to that later. And finally, the font developer is for me basically a type designer, because it's the person who would expand the glyph set, the styles, the feature of an existing design. They would assist basically the art director or the principal designer of a type project, but this is type design. Maybe this is what we would call type production, the development of a typeface, but this is still type design. And so if you expect a font engineer to also do font development or type development, they would need to be a type designer or to have a strong background in type design. Let's now review the list of skills you would be looking for in a font engineer, either to hire one or to become one. So a technical knowledge of type design is the basic, right? I mean, you can't really build, understand, check or correct a font if you don't know how it works. You would need to be skilled to use one or several font editing software. Saying that being fluent in one font editor should not go against being higher with a Foundry that is working with another font editor. Like, this is transversal skills, and once you learn how to use one, you can perfectly learn how to use the other. Theoretical and practical knowledge in typography in one or several specific script. So this one is a bit tricky in the sense that, for example, I wouldn't recommend to build a font if you have no knowledge about the script, because you need to be able to test the shape, like the text composition, the text shaping. And either you would have, like, for example, if you don't know much about Indic script and you need to engineer an Indic script, if you know about it, if you know how to test it, if you have the material to do it and you made a lot of research about it, it can be okay. But otherwise, you would probably need to work very closely with a designer that actually have some kind of engineering knowledge about Indic script. Understand font support of OS and text editor software. So this is, as the previous point, you need to test the font in use. And so for that, you need to know how the font is supported by the OS and the text editor. Like, for example, simple stuff as the style linking buttons, how they're supposed to work in a software or another, and the style ordering in the drop-down menu. And yeah, this is just little examples. And to do that, you can rely on the OpenType format specification, the OT spec, as we call it. So the OT spec is this, is like the Bible of software engineer and font engineer and type designer to understand the font format support. Like, for example, if you are a software engineer and you're making a new app, you will want to bring font support to that app, and to know how to do that, you will refer to the OT spec. For a font engineer, to know how what a font, like the font software, how it is expected to be, you would also rely on this list of rules. And if you're a type designer and you want to be a bit more empowered with font technology, this is also good reading. Of course, you don't have to understand it all, because there is very specific and technical vocabulary used for software engineer, but it is still like a good thing to know a bit about the different font tables and what how they interact together, what they allow and what they don't allow. Using the command line interface, so that might be a facultative skill, but I do believe, like, I really, really strongly recommend to have your way around it, because online you would find amazing libraries and scripts that would make your life better. And it's a way to interact directly on the font binaries, to fix them, patch them, etc. And you would close doors if you don't know how to use command line tools. Basic coding skills, I guess it is kind of linked to the previous point. You don't need to be a coder. I am not a coder. I mean, I've been lucky enough to always work with coding people within a team, but of course, if you're a Foundry, you would need a large budget to be able to have a team like that. Although if you work with external tools and libraries and compiling tools, it is a good thing to be able to understand a little bit of code, to be able to spot bugs, and I best to automate some repetitive tasks. And how to use version control service like GitHub is also very useful because, as said, if you use those libraries and those tools, those command line tools, you will need to report bugs to the tool maintainers, and this is often happening on GitHub. This way you would participate to the community and improve the environment of those tools. We now will try to define a possible font production process. Each font engineer has their own way of doing things, their own workflow, and I didn't find a particular standard method, just that some are more or less flexible or conservative in their approach. So yeah, here is a broad overview of what the font production process could look like. And important point, it is also the opportunity to look at the factors that would influence the prices and the timeline on a font production project. So the font making process include all the steps needed to make a font, from the first sketches to its publication. A first big step would be the type design process, which would result in a font that you can display and use to a certain extent. And the second big step would be the font production process that should result in a distributable product. When one finishes and the other start, it depends on your own workflow. Like some men say they start the production from the moment they draw the first curve. In that regard, the term production is a bit ambivalent and we should be a bit cautious with it. The first step would be the pre-production or mastering. So you could say that it's a bit counterintuitive to have the pre-production as part of the production process, but I see it like, for example, if you take the dressing up process, you will need to first prepare your clothes, and this is exactly the same. So this is the process of preparing source files, so the files that you need that need to be read with a font editor such as Glyph, RoboFont, FontLab, FontForge, etc. And so this process happens within the font editor software. The amount of work at this stage depends on the level of control on the expected export result. So for example, what you would do yourself and what you would let the compiling tool doing for you. A very simple example is that sometime during generation, some outlines need to be decomposed and merged. Do you decompose and merge beforehand so you have some kind of control over the point position, or you trust the compiling tool enough to do it itself? The targeted quality is more about the user experience, like the language support, the OpenType feature, the rendering and hinting. So basically, the more you do and the more time and money it's going to take. The expected environment of use. So for example, here we said there is some people that are more conservative or more flexible in their approach. This is meant for if you need, for example, your font to only work in Illustrator on Mac, or do you need the font to work across all available OS and also different versions of those OS? So in that regard, you need to be a bit more conservative or flexible. The state of the sources. So this may be obvious, but it not necessarily. Like when you work with a designer, the state of their file will add or lower the work expectation. If they are messy or organized, it can change a lot. The number of files, master, and glyphs. So of course, the more there is and the more work there is supposed to be, but it's actually not so interdependent in the case that like for some foundries, they are often quite surprised, like 2 projects with the same number of master don't cost the same. But as you can see, there is way more factor at play here. And sometimes a project that has less master could actually be more work for all those reasons. So this is all the like everything that need to be checked or set up during pre-production. Usually the designer set it up more or less nicely, and but yeah, it's never really as expected. So the role of the font engineer here would be to make sure that it is as expected. So this is usually what we call quality assurance of sources. And here there is the choice of correcting if wrong, completing if missing, or reporting to the designer so he correct or complete. The second step would be the build process. That is the process of generating, exporting, building font binaries. So we say binaries because it's the font file that is installed directly on the machine, and the OS doesn't need a third-party software to read it. So the build process can happen within the source file or using external files. And the amount of work at this stage would depend on the number of format, access, subsets, and instances per subset, because you will have to set them all up, and the expected environment of use. We could add here that the works at this stage also would depend on the compiling system that you would choose. So this is everything that you need to set up to build the font. So the design space should have been already set up before, but here you try to make it very consistent with the expected output, the instances in the font information, and of course what you choose as an export system. You could rely on the font editor export button, or you could rely on external build script. The third and final step would be the testing and proofing. So this is the quality assurance process of font binaries. It happens within the different environments of use. So for example, if the Foundry is targeting a customer that is using PowerPoint on Windows 7, you would have to test it in PowerPoint in Windows 7. The amount of work at this stage would depend on the number of output files, instances, and font feature. You will have to test them all, so the more there is, the more work there is. The number of environment types, and if you have a conservative or flexible approach of quality assurance. So this is everything you're gonna have to test: the installation, the usage, in each OS you're targeting, plus their different version, and the rendering. And I added here bug report because I think it's somehow our duty to the world to make font support a bit better. And this is the step where you're gonna find bugs in software. And so somehow you need to be able to know how to report to the companies the bugs so they can fix it. So this is the kind of local testing checklist that I use. It varies according to the stage of the file or the particular format. I don't want to make big advertisement about it, but we have a very detailed article about local testing in the new Google Font guide, which I participated to rewrite, and it is a really good way to start font engineering, actually. So yeah, go check it out on GitHub. And now let's talk about versioning. So it's the bit of the nerdy part of this presentation. So the 3-step we just explained before should actually be executed multiple times until you have a product that you can release. And these are the 4 stages for which you should repeat the 3 production steps. And a good way to reflect those stages is actually to use the font version. Versioning your font becomes extremely important from the moment you work with other people. First, because if there is a bug, it is easier to spot when it happened and also take responsibility for it. And secondly, you can use it as validation status, meaning like some kind of a contract with the Foundry. Once a stage has been validated, any step backward would lead to revise the budget and deadline. So there is different way to version your font. For example, Google Font recommends the semantic versioning method, which is supposed to reflect the level of changes. This can be quite useful in open source project, but I find it quite inadapted out of this context. And so I would personally recommend a development version method that would be adapted to those 4 stages. So from the moment that you're working toward a release, the first number of the version should reflect that. Are you working towards your first release? Then 1. Are you upgrading your font? Like you added a new you added more glyphs to it, and so you would use 2 because it's a second release. And I guess you would use 0 until you reach an alpha stage, meaning like until you start working with a Foundry or similar collaboration. The second number would reflect all the production stages. So 0 would be the alpha stage, meaning when the designer is going back and forth with the Foundry to improve the artistic direction in the design, taking feedback from the first talk into account. I want to add here that it would be actually quite useful to involve a font engineer at that stage to talk right away about what's possible or not, or how to achieve the designer intention in the best way, especially for fonts that have a complicated design space. It's a bit like consulting the printer at the beginning of a book design project. And finally, the 2 last numbers would be dedicated to the number of deliveries or exchanges between the designer and the Foundry or between collaborators. It is the number of external reviews, basically. So some people would increase that number at each build, but from experience, 2 numbers would not be enough in that case. So yeah, the number of time you send the file would actually already be enough to clarify all of that. Following the logic, the beta stage would be 1. So at this stage, you would be delivering a font under 1 format, the Foundry's favorite, to validate all the pre-production work. The delivery number would go back to 0 every time you upgrade to a new stage and increase with the number of exchanges. And 2 would be the pre-release file. So the pre-production has been validated, and now you're gonna deliver all the format and subset that the Foundry is expected. So trials, web, desktop, variable, static font, etc. And so when all of those are validated, you can export the ready for release files, number 3. And that would reflect the ultimate production step. Like instead of having files called final, you would be at 0.3 version plus the number of exchanging, because it can happen multiple times that you build these ready for release files. I now would like to talk about some case studies to show you different engineering strategies that we could have depending on the Foundry profile. And so, yeah, during my own career, I had the opportunity to work very different foundries, from the one-person foundry run by a graphic designer to a massive distribution platform such as Google Font. This situation, which I consider rich in experience, allow me to draw those profiles and, yeah, to give you those different strategies. The first one would be the small graphic design studio. So this is usually held by one or two founders, and they don't necessarily have a lot of technical collaborators for the font making process. I mean, maybe they would have an intern, but that's it. Their outreach is mostly national, the retail catalog is quite small, and the release happen occasionally over the years. Like they do that more or less on the side because their income would come from design project, like the retail font is not the main income, and they would target designers or themselves. So one of the example would be, for example, a graphic design studio working on a brand identity. They make a logo. For that logo, they create few letters of a font, and they decide to develop that font into a proper retail product that they would then distribute from their platform. The design quality is variable because, as we said, graphic designer making font as a side project, and the technical complexity could be quite low. I don't mean low as a bad thing. Like technical complexity is more about like axes and number of styles. What I encounter the most is like one or two styles and a weight axis. So the font would be used most of all in Adobe InDesign because the print is also targeted a lot, and it has to be compatible with a Mac OS. And so the strategy for that profile, I would say that engineering, I mean it as a human resources, like added human resource, would not be necessary. I mean, from the moment that you have a easy technical font, you can perfectly rely on the font editor export button to produce the font. And from the moment that you have a quality assurance approach that is tolerant and limited, so for example, limited to the environment that you are using yourself, then you are perfectly fine. What I saw is that from the moment that this graphic design studio has a more ambitious font project, like for example, they made the logo for the brand, for the branding company, and the company wants to use the logo internally in all the branches with all the employees, blah, blah, blah. In that case, the graphic design studio actually subcontract the development of the font to a foundry that has the technical knowledge and ability to produce such a project. So the second case would be the indie foundry. So I only have experience with a small, medium size foundry. Like it would be like this profile would be harder to apply to a Ivy League foundry such as Dalton Mag, Type Together, Commercial Type, Typotech, Rosetta, who are here for many years now and offering a large range of scripts through their font catalog. So this small, medium-sized foundry is a actual company living out of the distribution of retail fonts. Their outreach is mostly continental. The retail catalog is big but maintainable by the foundry itself, and the releases needs to be quite regular. They would target branding companies because if they live out of retail fonts distribution sell, actually what would bring good money would be to make custom font out of them for companies. And so the design quality is often very high, the technical complexity can be ambitious, and the usage need to be quite broad with a cross-platform compatibility. In that case, I would recommend an in-house engineering. So when I use the term employee at first, it can be many things like interns, freelancer, full-time position, like in different roles such as marketing, copywriter, and font engineer. And if there is not enough work for a full-time position, like a part-time, regular freelance would be adapted. And so since creating an entire toolchain would be extremely expensive, what is made for those profiles is usually to adapt an existing toolchain to the Foundry expectation. And since the compatibility needs to be cross-platform, the font needs to work on Mac, on Windows, on web, in print, the approach would need to be flexible, conservative, in the sense that it needs to be conservative, but it doesn't need to target users on Windows 7, for example. If there is such user, then it would be it would be the opportunity to make a custom file for that customer. And finally, the big IT corp. So let's be straightforward. I only have experience with Google Fonts, for which I've been a contractor for a bit more than 2 years. But yeah, I wanted to also refer to other companies. Like, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if the profile is similar to Monotype or Adobe, although of course I can't talk for any of those. I also have to say I'm not talking for Google Font here. I'm only the contractor. I just want to show different strategies. And so this is a very big company that has a very big team dedicated to fonts. And so there is a team for maintaining the API, a team for maintaining the fonts, a team that is onboarding the font, a team that is creating fonts, a team that is creating tools to produce the fonts. So this is quite an industrial production. The outreach is worldwide, and the retail catalog is huge. Like it really demands a huge effort to maintain it. Also because the releases are happening very often. So this is kind of a American mindset. You always have to get new thing for the users. And so they would target any web users, but the income would come from their IT services they provide. What is important here is that the font is actually a derivative product that gives value to the digital service they give. And so the design quality is very variable because it can be commission project to a very high quality foundry to submission from an amateur type designer, and this is the beauty of it. And same, the technical complexity, very variable. So the main usage is of course the proprietary software. So if we speak about Google Font, it would be Workspace, Google Doc, etc. And if we talk about Adobe, it would be the Adobe suites, Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, etc. And so since the target can be any web users, the compatibility needs to be cross-platform and backward. Like the average web user could be using Internet Explorer on Windows 7, and in that case, the font product and the digital services need to work in that environment. And so the engineering here is industrial, like there is really a team that is dedicated just to create font production tools. And so the production system rely on that created toolchain. And since, as we say, any user is targeted and the compatibility is cross-platform and backward, we need a very conservative approach of quality assurance. And so this can create some kind of paradox in the sense that if you commission a project with a very high technical complexity, it can happen that the API is actually not able to distribute it entirely. Like it would, like what I mean is that this system makes it difficult for out of standard font to adapt because it needs to be very strict. So yeah, where to start? How to learn about font engineering? First of all, I gathered with the help of people a list of links, resources that you can check it out. There you can already find a lot to read. For now, it is just a Notion page turned into an HTML page. It's not very beautiful, but the idea is to make it grow. And if you also have links to add, especially for engineering or producing other scripts than Latin or Greek, because this is the only two scripts that I have experience with. Yeah, don't hesitate to send me an email. And then really where to start, I would recommend to make a font, export the font and test it. So as I said, the Google font guide that we wrote has a lot of little tips and tricks about font engineering. And the chapter that I would advise first are the one about local testing, outline quality, and diacritics. There you could already find a lot of information. And I would add you could download this application called Font Table Viewer. So this is an app that allows you, like you drag and drop a font in it, and it allows you to see inside it the font tables. And what is very good about it is that it is linking the actual font table with the related chapter in the OT spec. Otherwise, you could try to use Font Bakery, which is a tool developed by Google Font for quality assurance of font binaries. So you could definitely check that out. And also, if you find a bug in your font, I would advise to find GitHub issues that got fixed or that are still open and see the conversation about it. It is a really good way to learn about font engineering. Some projection, I guess, to open or close a debate. Actually, will engineering still be needed in the future? Short answer, yes. I think as long as font technology and environments in which they are used are evolving, there will be a need for people to understand them. So a designer can focus on design. Font projects are also so unique. I'm quite certain that an algorithm can't replace a human eyes for still some time. The tools are here to help, not to replace us. And also the democratization of the font making tools had the result in opening up the type design profession, actually. And so the demand for font engineering is there and growing. And I must add, women are very needed in that field. The talk is finished. This is all the questions that I have for you to get feedback. And so I really hope that we can manage to find each other in a chatting room, to chat about that. Also, if you have some question, don't hesitate. But if we don't have time to go into too much details, don't hesitate to send me an email. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rosalie. That was... For me, it was enlightening. I think for people that know less about font engineering, I think it must have been extremely enlightening. I think you ought to be congratulated on putting together such a comprehensive talk as that. I think we all learned from that. Even just detailed things like being methodical about your version numbers. I'm not good at that myself. I've got my own final sometimes I think we all slip into that, but it's,
although it's more an ideal than something that I mean there is always forgotten sometimes, but the I guess if you have 2 or 3 times a confusion with a client that end up costing you money because you confuse the font version and you can't say who is to blame, because the font version is also here for that. Like, hey, I gave you the 1.4 And when you gave me back the 1.41, it was broken. So what did you do? And so if you mess up a bit, like, then it's on your shoulder.
Well, I suppose one thing, maybe you didn't mention it, but you've got to find all this stuff totally fascinating in the first place before you embark on a career as a font engineer. Hopefully you find it fascinating. And certainly some of my own projects that have paid very well have come from experimentation in my own time. And I wonder how does that, do you find some projects come from your own experimentation? And if so, how do you create time for them, and where does the inspiration come from?
You mean for my own experiments?
Yeah, your own experiments in how to engineer fonts, or maybe.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I design typeface myself, so I test them, and when and also it's like I always so for Foundries when I do some freelance job for them, I quote a certain number of time, and in this I always include a little percentage of time just for finding new bugs, retesting new environments. I always ask my clients if they would allow me to send their file to the software maintainers so they can, for example, with Georg, we have a lot of exchanges to improve glyphs, and it often comes with a project from private clients, because Google Font is a very specific environment and we don't test it much out of that environment. So the most experience that I do are with the private client, private project, my own and the ones of the client. And so since I've been working almost full time for Google Font, I don't have so many clients anymore. But what I do is that I have a subcontractor, a trainee, Emma, that is awesome. I've been training her for a year, and since she is taking on my contract and testing the font and doing mistake herself, we also find more bugs this way. Like, oh, this one is new, I didn't know. Training her definitely make me more aware of the entire process. And of course, since I design my own typefaces with my own little cooking, I happen to find some stuff. And also what I find interesting is the different approach for each foundries. Some foundries want to be able to export themselves the font. And so you need to find an easy process that does not resemble to a very complicated build script that they can't edit themselves. And some other foundries are completely relying on you for, oh, there is a problem with this kerning, we change it, can you re-export? And you become an export button. This is what I try to avoid with a private client, because I mean, it's not nice for them to pay me 50 euros every time they need me to export. It's a bit ridiculous.
They need to pay you to automate it so that small changes they can rebuild.
But the problem, like any automation process, include the terminal and or any command line interface and little entry command. And I can understand that you can get allergic to it or scared, or you don't want to deal with that. Like, they have other stuff to do. So
yeah. Now, one thing that occurred to me is it might be useful to maybe to that document you linked us to. Of course, we can't. No single organization or person can train somebody how to be a genius font engineer, but just some starter. If Unicode is a bit of a mystery to you, what are the first steps to go to get your head around Unicode, or starting with Python, or starting with GitHub, starting with the terminal? You want to understand TTX and FontMake. What are those like a little get on the? How do you start? Do you have a process in mind for when someone joins you?
I have my own knowledge accumulation in a spreadsheet and in a Notion-based table. And for example, when I am with a trainee, we will work together into growing this knowledge gathering. which is, for example, everything we learn, everything that person learned, they put it in a corner in a Notion page. For example, one time I was told that some math symbols shouldn't be italicized and some should be. And so we find the source of this information, and we save the document in a drive. And then I try to make a check in Foundry, or I request a check in Foundry, because for me, Foundry is a universal knowledge in font support. And so, for example, then I have like some links. The Unicode, I would recommend to go to the website Decode Unicode. That is vulgarizing a bit the entire how do you say, matter, subject.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And to get into Python, I'm a very wrong person to answer that question, because I tried and I never really got into it. But there are a lot of simple resources online. For the simple, I always recommend to go to the font software tutorial. Like, Adam wrote an extensive documentation for FontLab. It's just great to read it. Rainer wrote this incredible documentation for glyphs. There is also very good knowledge in the FontForge documentation. Like, they really accompany you step by step, first for the design, but they also have they have a deepened approach that is linked to font engineering as soon as you start with font tables and stuff like that.
I think they're all fully aware that their apps is not simply the export button. There's a lot more to it.
Definitely. And otherwise, the GF guide, so the documentation of Google Font, we've tried to add this kind of stuff. For example, for me, a good introduction in font engineering is understanding Bezier curve and outlines, because often, like, I know, like, as a type designer for years, I didn't understand that the point on top of a curve was connecting two curves. I thought it was just a point placed there. And the curve was the entire arc. And no, it's a connection. And so little stuff to understand. And so that's why I linked the outline quality article, because I think it's a very good introduction to that. And then navigating requirements, little by little, you get into the font table system. And for this, I like, I think I said it in the talk, but I like a font table viewer, because you put your font in it, you look inside the table, and it is linked to the OpenType specification. And so little by little, you can also see like that. But yeah, the best way, I think, is to test the font. First, understand how the font should behave in the software, like the bold button, the italic button, and to understand that. And if there is something that doesn't work, dive into it, and at some point you find something in a GitHub issue.
Sure. Thanks for that. That's. I'm going to go to a question we have in the Q&A section, and well, feel free to answer it in your own way. I'll just read it out so that other people can, who didn't see it, can hear it. It's from Guillaume Berry. Do you see opportunities in having font engineering software instead of command line UI, like a TTX app? Not to replace font engineers, but to streamline the process and improve collaboration. And he adds, in your opinion, is it the sole responsibility of font engineers to do maintenance support of the font software?
So for the first question, what does Streamline mean?
I think the idea would be that the command line, I think he's implying that command line tools are still off-putting, and there's a lot of engineering, in quotes, that you could do if there were an application with a graphical UI.
The streamlining is more simplifying and speeding up the process.
Yes.
So imagine TTX were built with a full Mac OS or Windows UI.
I guess it depends. It depends on the user. For example, when I first learned about Font Bakery, there was actually a website where you could drag and drop your font, and it was outputting a report, and it was awesome. Like really, I think for users who just start with those tools, it's the best way to do it, to have this some kind of UI, of course. But then when you get more into it, you need to be able to edit the code when you need it, or you need to make some more specific testing or debugging or stuff like that. And also, I think from the tool maintainer point of view, you would need a tremendous team to be able to update the tool and the UI. And it's probably faster to update the tool, to have them always up to the last specification and the last technology if there is no UI. I mean, I see it in the open source world. The tools with UI, they don't get updated as often as the command line tools.
Right. Well, in fact, we can talk about Font Table Viewer and compare that with TTX. I'd imagine that TTX is quicker to respond to a
and also
than Font Table Viewer. No disrespect to Font Table Viewer, it does kind of the same things if you're just reading tables.
So it is more like the experience and proficiency of the developer, which is going to dictate if you're starting out and software UI would be easier, but then as you got more experienced, it's easier to just get under the hood and really look at the thing itself, I suppose.
And you start to prefer the text export as well. If I needed to create some state of my font, I'd rather have a TTX dump than something from Font Table Viewer. I don't know what it would export, a screenshot, or it's not very satisfactory, or PDF. These aren't satisfactory things for a software engineer.
Sometimes it doesn't really interpret the result. Like from some style linking bits, I noticed that there is no result in one of the table. But also with TTX, you can just export the table that you need. You can diff very easily. Like you get more to the point that you need. And somehow I developed also trust issues with the UI of certain tools. I prefer to see the bits of the FS selection entry to be sure that it is the 0 or the 1 that I want, instead of trusting the tool to tell me this means bolds or italic.
Absolutely, I agree there. I think, doesn't DTL have some tools which claim to be very direct in terms of editing OpenType fields? I don't use them myself. Maybe OT Master is one of those.
Yeah, definitely.
We are 5 minutes out. I suggest that we have the last question, and then we can continue the conversation in the Hangout space, because we will have another talk starting in 5 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Should we just take this one question?
One question from Mei Chung. What in your experience could explain why women are not plentiful in this field?
It's a tech field. So already type design is a quite mainly field. It became more and more, there is more and more women, of course, although they're a bit less visible. But font engineering is closer to the to the software engineering world, developer world, coding world, that is extremely masculine. And somehow dealing with a lot of people in that field, I notice that women tend to have the imposter syndrome. I mean, women tend to have imposter syndrome in the workplace. That is, there are studies about that. But the developing community can be quite hard. Like so I see where it can be dissatisfying and scary for women, and definitely extremely frustrating. I never experienced so much mansplaining since I'm working for Google, and not from my peers at Google, from the users that are coming to GitHub and telling me, hey, what you do is wrong. And I'm like, I'm basically applying the requirements here. So, but it's also, I guess, the open source and the GitHub, like you have to imagine that it's all people working alone from their home behind a screen. And so it's like Twitter, like there is no filtering or anything. It can be pretty hard at first. I'm very happy that in the team at Google Font, I have other female colleagues, so we can support each other. So also, I think there's no many women because there's no many people. And so you often see a lot of fields where there is less women from the start. And if there is even less people, then there is even less women. And also because most of the font engineer also come from the software engineer field, that is already also very masculine. So.
And also probably representation. If more people would see your talk and your peers, female peers, people would, women would understand like, hey, why not me? So I guess that's also can be a factor. That's why it's very important to like put a spotlight on the female designers and engineers and so on, that women understand like, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. I can be there too. And I guess it's neat. See, I'm mansplaining right now, so I'm going to stop. And we're
you're perfectly right.
We're going to move over to the Hangout room. We're 2 minutes out before the others start, so we're going to leave it here. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Rosalie, that was a brilliant talk. It was very enlightening. I think everybody agreed. I saw many positive reactions, so thank you so much for this presentation. And
thank you.
Do you have some time to move over to the Hangout room if anybody still wants to ask you questions?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I will be there.
Okay, excellent. We'll be there. Everybody, thank you for
attending. Thanks again, Rosalie. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.